Damn Doll. Part 1. I never believed in haunted objects. Ghost stories were for campfires and bad horror movies, but real life was grounded in the tangible and explainable. Or so I thought. Everything changed when I found the doll. It started innocently enough. I had recently inherited my grandparents' old house, a creaky, dilapidated mansion on the outskirts of town. The house had been in the family for generations, passed down from one relative to the next, each adding their own layer of history and mystery. I was the last in line, the reluctant heir to a crumbling relic of the past. I moved in on a dreary autumn day, the sky an ominous shade of gray. The movers had just left, and I was alone with my thoughts and a mountain of boxes. Deciding to take a break from the unpacking, I explored the house. It was larger than I remembered, each room filled with antique furniture and the ghosts of memories. The attic had always been off-limits when I was a child. My grandmother used to say it was too dangerous, filled with old furniture and forgotten junk. But now, curiosity got the better of me. I climbed the narrow, creaking staircase, each step echoing in the stillness of the house. At the top, a heavy wooden door barred my way. It took some effort, but I finally managed to wrench it open. The attic was a cavernous space, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierced through the small, grimy windows. Boxes and old trunks were stacked haphazardly, covered in decades of dust and cobwebs. I began to sift through them, uncovering old clothes, yellowed photographs, and tarnished trinkets. It was in one of the far corners that I found the doll. It was tucked away in a small, ornate chest, wrapped in a faded silk cloth. As soon as I laid eyes on it, a chill ran down my spine. The doll was unlike any I had ever seen. It was exquisitely crafted, with porcelain skin and glass eyes that seemed almost lifelike. Its dress was an elaborate Victorian gown, now tattered and stained with age. But it was the expression on its face that unsettled me the most. The doll wore a serene, almost knowing smile, its eyes seeming to follow me no matter where I moved. I should have left it there, but something compelled me to take it downstairs. I placed it on the mantel in the living room, and for a moment, it almost seemed to brighten the room. But that night, the nightmares began. I woke up drenched in sweat, the remnants of a horrific dream lingering in my mind. In the dream, I was standing in the attic, the doll cradled in my arms. It whispered to me in a language I couldn't understand, its glass eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I felt an overwhelming urge to obey, to follow its commands, though I couldn't comprehend the words. Shaking off the feeling, I tried to go back to sleep, but the sense of unease lingered. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Doors would creak open on their own. Objects would move without explanation, and I could swear I heard faint whispers echoing through the halls at night. Each time I passed the doll, its eyes seemed to gleam with a sinister light. One evening, unable to take it anymore, I decided to get rid of the doll. I wrapped it in a thick blanket and took it out to the trash. I felt a strange resistance, almost as if the doll was clinging to my hands. But I forced myself to let go. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of relief. But the next morning, the doll was back on the mantel, its smile wider than before. My heart raced as I stared at it, trying to convince myself that I had simply forgotten to throw it away. But deep down, I knew the truth. I tried everything. I burned it, buried it, even drove miles out of town to leave it in a dumpster. Each time the doll would reappear in the house, more malevolent than before. It began to invade my thoughts, its whispers growing louder and more insistent. I started to lose track of time, my days blurring into a haze of fear and paranoia. The doll wanted something from me, something dark and terrible. I could feel its influence growing stronger, its grip on my mind tightening. The nightmares became more vivid, the commands clearer. I tried to resist, but it was a losing battle. The doll was relentless, its malevolent presence seeping into every corner of my mind. One night, as I sat in the living room staring at the doll, I heard a faint scratching noise coming from the attic. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly made my way up the stairs, the sound growing louder with each step. When I reached the top, I saw the attic door was ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning me inside. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't. The doll's whispers urged me forward, compelling me to enter the attic. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the narrow windows. I could barely make out the shapes of the boxes and trunks, but in the center of the room, I saw a figure. It was a man, his face obscured by shadow. He stood motionless, his eyes fixed on me. My breath caught in my throat as he slowly raised a hand, pointing to the far corner of the attic. Trembling, I followed his gesture and saw another small, ornate chest, identical to the one where I had found the doll. With shaking hands, I opened the chest. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it, and my blood ran cold. The journal belonged to my great-grandfather, and it detailed the horrifying history of the doll. Part 2. The pages of the journal were brittle, their edges crumbling under my fingertips. As I read, a sense of dread settled over me. My great-grandfather, Samuel, had meticulously recorded his encounters with the doll, each entry more disturbing than the last. The journal began with an innocent discovery, much like mine. Samuel had found the doll in the attic shortly after moving into the house, a family heirloom passed down from his own grandfather. He had placed it on the mantel, enchanted by its lifelike appearance. But it didn't take long for him to realize that something was very wrong. The early entries described strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, faint whispers in the dead of night, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. Samuel had tried to dismiss these incidents as figments of his imagination, but the doll's influence grew stronger. It began to invade his dreams, whispering in an ancient, incomprehensible language. The commands were insidious, burrowing into his subconscious, urging him to commit unspeakable acts. One entry stood out, dated a few months after Samuel found the doll. It detailed a night of sheer terror. Samuel had woken up to find the doll sitting at the foot of his bed, its glass eyes glowing with a sinister light. Paralyzed with fear, he had watched as the doll slowly turned its head towards him, its mouth opening to reveal rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. It had whispered to him, a single word that echoed in his mind: obey. From that night on, Samuel's life became a waking nightmare. The doll's hold over him tightened, its whispers becoming more insistent. He tried to resist, but each attempt only seemed to strengthen the doll's power. He wrote of waking up in strange places, his hands covered in blood, with no memory of what he had done. The doll's influence was relentless, driving him to the brink of madness. Desperate, Samuel had sought out a way to break the doll's curse. He traveled far and wide, consulting with scholars, mystics, and occultists. Each offered a different solution, but none were successful. The doll's presence persisted, its malevolent spirit growing ever more powerful. In the final pages of the journal, Samuel's writing grew increasingly frantic, his sanity slipping away. He wrote of dark rituals, forbidden texts, and a last-ditch effort to contain the doll's evil. The final entry was a chilling account of a ritual performed in the dead of night. Samuel had drawn a circle of salt in the attic, placing the doll in the center. He had chanted incantations from a book of dark magic, hoping to bind the doll's spirit. But something had gone terribly wrong. The circle had shattered, and the doll had vanished. Samuel's last words were a desperate plea for forgiveness, his handwriting barely legible. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The doll's curse had plagued my family for generations, and now it had found me. I glanced at the doll on the mantel, its eyes glinting in the dim light. I knew I had to find a way to break the curse, but I was terrified of what might happen if I failed. The next few days were a blur of research and restless nights. I pored over Samuel's journal, trying to decipher the rituals and incantations he had described. I searched through the attic, hoping to find the book of dark magic he had mentioned, but it was nowhere to be found. The doll's whispers grew louder, filling my mind with dark thoughts and violent urges. I felt my sanity slipping away, just as Samuel had. One night, as I sat in the living room, I heard a faint knocking sound. It was coming from the basement, a place I had avoided since moving in. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay as I descended the stairs. the old wooden steps creaking under my weight. The basement was dark and damp, the walls lined with shelves of forgotten tools and broken furniture. In the far corner, I saw a figure crouching in the shadows. My heart raced as I approached, my flashlight casting a weak beam of light. It was a man, his face gaunt and eyes hollow. He looked up at me and I recognized him from the old family photos, my great-grandfather Samuel. "You're not real," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I am real," he replied, his voice a rasping whisper. "And so is the doll. You must destroy it before it destroys you." "But how?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "I've tried everything." "There is a way," Samuel said, his eyes gleaming with a dark light. "But it is dangerous. You must perform the ritual, but this time you must do it right. The book you seek is hidden in the walls of this house. Find it, and follow the instructions to the letter. Only then can you hope to break the curse." With that, he vanished, leaving me alone in the dark, musty basement. I searched the walls, tapping and prying at the wooden panels until I found a loose board. Behind it was a small, hidden compartment, and inside was the book, a leather-bound tome of ancient and forbidden magic. I took the book upstairs, my hands shaking as I flipped through its pages. The rituals described within were dark and dangerous, but I knew I had no choice. The doll's influence was growing stronger by the day, and I could feel my mind unraveling. I had to act quickly before it was too late. That night, I prepared for the ritual. I drew a circle of salt in the attic, placing the doll in the center. I lit candles and chanted the incantations, my voice echoing in the stillness of the house. The air grew thick with the scent of sulfur, and a dark presence filled the room. The doll's eyes glowed with a malevolent light, its mouth twisting into a sinister smile. As I continued the ritual, the room grew colder, and a feeling of dread washed over me. The shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around the circle of salt. I could hear faint whispers, growing louder with each passing moment. The doll's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a surge of fear. I knew I was tampering with forces beyond my understanding, but I had no choice. The final incantation was the most dangerous. It required a blood sacrifice. My own. With trembling hands, I pricked my finger and let a few drops of blood fall onto the doll. The reaction was immediate. The circle of salt flared with a bright, blinding light, and the doll let out a piercing scream. The shadows recoiled, and I felt a force pulling at my mind, trying to drag me into darkness. Part 3. The force pulling at my mind was overpowering, a relentless tide of darkness that threatened to consume me. I fought against it, clinging to the incantations as if they were a lifeline. The doll's scream echoed in my ears, a cacophony of anguish and fury. I could feel its malevolent presence writhing within the circle, straining against the bonds of the ritual. The candles flickered wildly, their flames dancing in the icy air. The attic seemed to contract and expand, the walls warping as the shadows twisted and churned. I struggled to maintain my focus, my vision blurring as the incantation reached its climax. The final words left my lips in a breathless whisper, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a deafening crack, the circle of salt shattered, and the doll was engulfed in a burst of searing light. I was thrown backward, my head striking the wooden floor with a sickening thud. The pain was immediate and blinding, and darkness closed in around me. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was the doll, its glass eyes blazing with a malevolent fury. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold attic floor, my head throbbing with pain. The candles had burned out, and the attic was plunged into darkness. The air was thick with the acrid smell of sulfur and burnt wood. I groaned and tried to sit up, my body protesting with every movement. As my vision cleared, I saw the doll lying in the center of the attic, its porcelain face cracked and blackened. For a moment, I dared to hope that the ritual had worked, that the doll's curse had been broken. But as I staggered to my feet, I realized that something was terribly wrong. The air was heavy with an oppressive sense of dread, and I could hear a faint mocking laughter echoing in the darkness. I stumbled down the stairs, my legs weak and unsteady. The house felt different, as if it were alive with a dark energy. The walls seemed to pulse and breathe, and the shadows moved of their own accord. I reached the living room and collapsed onto the couch, my mind racing with fear and confusion. The doll's whispers had stopped, but in their place was a new presence, darker, more insidious. I could feel it watching me, lurking just beyond the edge of my awareness. It was as if the ritual had not banished the doll's spirit, but had instead unleashed something far more malevolent. Days passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. I barely slept, the oppressive presence in the house growing stronger with each passing moment. I searched for a solution, poring over the ancient tome and Samuel's journal, but found nothing that could explain what had happened. The rituals and incantations seemed to blur together, their meaning lost in the fog of my mind. One night, as I sat in the living room, I heard a faint tapping sound. It was coming from the attic. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly made my way upstairs, the sound growing louder with each step. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. The presence in the house compelled me forward, drawing me towards the source of the sound. I opened the attic door, and the tapping ceased. The room was dark and still, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. I stepped inside, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. The doll was gone, the circle of salt a scattered mess on the floor. I scanned the room, my heart racing, and then I saw it, a figure standing in the far corner, shrouded in shadows. It was a man, his face hidden in the darkness. He stepped forward and I gasped. It was Samuel, his eyes hollow and his skin ashen. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and anger, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "You have unleashed something terrible," he said, his voice a hollow whisper. "The doll was a vessel, a conduit for a dark spirit. The ritual did not destroy it, it set it free." I trembled, my mind reeling. What do I do? How do I stop it? "There is only one way," Samuel replied, his eyes burning with an eerie light. "You must find the doll and bind it once more. But this time, you must use a stronger vessel, one that can contain its power." "How?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What kind of vessel?" Samuel stepped closer, his presence cold and unsettling. "A living vessel," he whispered. "A human soul." I recoiled, horror flooding through me. "No, I can't. There must be another way." "There is no other way," Samuel said, his voice firm. "The spirit is too powerful. It will consume you and everyone you love if you do not act." I stared at him, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The thought of sacrificing a human soul was unthinkable, but the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. The dark presence in the house was growing stronger, and I could feel it closing in around me. Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ornate dagger. "This will help you," he said, handing it to me. "But you must act quickly. The spirit is already seeking a new host." I took the dagger, its cold metal sending a shiver through me. "I don't know if I can do this," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You have no choice," Samuel replied, his eyes piercing into mine. "You must be strong, for the sake of your family, for the sake of your soul." With that he vanished, leaving me alone in the dark attic. I stood there for a moment, the weight of the dagger heavy in my hand. The reality of what I had to do was almost too much to bear, but I knew I had no choice. The dark spirit was relentless, and it would stop at nothing to consume me. I made my way back downstairs, my mind racing with fear and determination. The house was silent, the oppressive presence hanging in the air like a dark cloud. I could feel the spirit watching me, its malevolent gaze piercing through the shadows. I had to find the doll and bind the spirit once more. But this time, I needed a living vessel. The thought of sacrificing a human soul filled me with dread, but I knew it was the only way. The spirit was too powerful, and if I did not act, it would destroy me and everyone I loved. The search for a living vessel was fraught with fear and uncertainty. I could feel the spirit's influence growing stronger, its dark whispers filling my mind. I knew I had to act quickly before it was too late. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I found the doll. It was lying in the basement, its porcelain face cracked and blackened. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I could feel the spirit's presence, seething with malevolent energy. I took a deep breath and raised the dagger, my hands trembling. The ritual had to be performed perfectly, or the spirit would escape and wreak havoc once more. I began the incantations, my voice steady and firm, the words flowing from my lips like a river of darkness. The doll's eyes glowed with a sinister light, and I could feel the spirit's rage, its fury burning through the air. I continued the ritual, my voice rising above the cacophony of whispers and screams. The air grew colder, and the shadows twisted and writhed, but I pressed on, determined to see it through. As the final words left my lips, I plunged the dagger into the doll's heart. The reaction was immediate. The room was filled with a blinding light, and the spirit let out a piercing scream. I could feel its dark energy being drawn into the dagger, the malevolent presence being sealed away. When the light faded, I was left standing in the dark basement, the doll lying lifeless at my feet. The oppressive presence was gone, and the air felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. I had done it. The spirit was bound once more, and the doll's curse was broken. But as I looked at the dagger in my hand, I knew that the battle was far from over. The spirit was still trapped within the blade, its malevolent energy waiting for a chance to escape. I had to find a way to contain it, to ensure that it could never harm anyone again. I took the doll and the dagger and made my way upstairs, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The house was silent, the shadows no longer moving of their own accord. I felt a sense of relief, but also a lingering fear. The dark spirit was still out there, and I had to be vigilant. Part 4. The silence in the house was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos that had ensued just moments before. I stood in the dimly lit hallway, the doll and dagger clutched in my hands, my mind reeling with the gravity of what I had just done. The oppressive presence that had haunted me for days was gone, but I could still feel the lingering darkness, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. I needed to act quickly. The spirit might be trapped within the dagger for now, but it wouldn't stay contained forever. I needed to find a way to permanently seal it, to ensure that it could never harm anyone again. The ancient tome I had found in the attic might hold the answers, but deciphering its cryptic texts would take time. Time I wasn't sure I had. I made my way to the study, where I had left the tome. The room was cold, the air thick with the scent of old books and aged wood. I placed the doll and dagger on the desk and opened the tome, my eyes scanning the yellowed pages for any hint of how to bind the spirit permanently. The rituals described within were complex and dangerous, each one requiring precise execution and a deep understanding of dark magic. As I read, a sense of dread settled over me. The tome spoke of ancient spirits, powerful entities that could be bound only by the strongest of magics. The ritual I needed to perform required not only the blood of the summoner, but also a conduit, a living vessel that could contain the spirit's energy. My great-grandfather had hinted at this, but seeing it in black and white made it all the more real, and all the more terrifying. The thought of sacrificing a human soul still filled me with horror, but I knew that the alternative was even worse. The spirit's malevolent energy would consume me if I didn't act, and it would then move on to torment others. I had to find a way to bind it no matter the cost. The hours passed in a blur as I pored over the tome, piecing together the ritual step by step. The incantations were complex, the symbols intricate. I practiced the chants under my breath, my voice barely more than a whisper in the stillness of the study. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing minute, and I could feel the spirit's presence growing stronger, its dark energy pulsing from the dagger. As night fell, the shadows in the room deepened, and I knew it was time to act. I gathered the necessary ingredients, candles, salt, and a ceremonial knife, and made my way to the basement. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seemed to close in around me as I descended the stairs. I could feel the spirit watching me, its malevolent gaze piercing through the darkness. I set up the ritual space in the center of the basement, drawing a circle of salt on the cold, damp floor. I placed the doll and dagger in the center and lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. I took a deep breath and began the incantations, my voice steady and firm. The air grew colder, and I could feel the spirit's rage building, its energy swirling around me like a dark cloud. The shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing in the candlelight. I continued the chant, my voice rising above the cacophony of whispers and screams. The symbols etched into the floor glowed with a faint, eerie light, and I knew that the ritual was working. As the incantation reached its climax, I took the ceremonial knife and made a small cut on my palm, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the doll. The reaction was immediate. The spirit let out a piercing scream, and the room was filled with a blinding light. I could feel its dark energy being drawn into the salt circle, the malevolent presence being sealed away. But then, something went wrong. The light flickered and dimmed, and the spirit's scream turned into mocking laughter. The circle of salt shattered, and the doll's eyes glowed with a sinister light. The spirit had broken free, its dark energy swirling around the room in a frenzy. Panic gripped me as I realized that the ritual had failed. The spirit was too powerful, its malevolent energy too strong to be contained. I stumbled backward, the shadows closing in around me. The spirit's presence was overwhelming, its rage palpable. I could feel it clawing at my mind, trying to drag me into darkness. Desperation took hold, and I knew I had to do something, anything to stop the spirit. I grabbed the dagger, its blade cold and heavy in my hand, and plunged it into the doll's heart. The reaction was immediate. The room was filled with a blinding light, and the spirit let out a piercing scream. I could feel its dark energy being drawn into the dagger, the malevolent presence being sealed away. But as the light faded, I realized that the battle was far from over. The spirit was still trapped within the dagger, its malevolent energy waiting for a chance to escape. I had to find a way to contain it, to ensure that it could never harm anyone again. I took the doll and the dagger and made my way upstairs, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The house was silent, the shadows no longer moving of their own accord. I felt a sense of relief, but also a lingering fear. The dark spirit was still out there, and I had to be vigilant. The answer came to me in a moment of clarity. The spirit needed a living vessel, a soul strong enough to contain its malevolent energy. I had to find someone willing to take on this burden, someone who could withstand the darkness and keep the spirit contained. The thought filled me with dread, but I knew it was the only way. I spent the next few days searching for someone who fit the criteria. It was a daunting task, and each day the spirit's presence grew stronger, its whispers more insistent. I could feel it clawing at the edges of my mind, trying to break free. The house seemed to pulse with dark energy, the shadows growing longer and more twisted. Finally, I found a potential vessel, an old friend who had dabbled in the occult and had a strong will. I explained the situation to him, the gravity of what I was asking, and to my surprise, he agreed. He understood the risks, but was willing to help, knowing the alternative was far worse. The night of the final ritual arrived, and we gathered in the basement. The air was thick with tension and fear, but also a sense of resolve. We set up the ritual space, drawing the circle of salt and placing the doll and dagger in the center. My friend stood outside the circle, ready to take on the spirit's burden. I began the incantations, my voice steady and firm. The air grew colder, and I could feel the spirit's rage building, its energy swirling around us like a dark cloud. The shadows twisted and writhed, and the symbols etched into the floor glowed with an eerie light. I continued the chant, my voice rising above the cacophony of whispers and screams. As the incantation reached its climax, my friend stepped into the circle, his eyes determined and unafraid. I took the ceremonial knife and made a small cut on his palm, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the doll. The reaction was immediate. The spirit let out a piercing scream, and the room was filled with a blinding light. I could feel its dark energy being drawn into my friend, the malevolent presence being sealed away. The light faded, and the room fell silent. My friend stood in the center of the circle, his eyes glowing with a faint, eerie light. The spirit was contained, its malevolent energy trapped within his soul. The burden was immense, but he bore it with strength and resolve. The ritual had worked, the spirit was bound, and the doll's curse was broken. But the cost was great, and the burden would be carried for the rest of my friend's life. I vowed to do everything in my power to help him, to ensure that the spirit remained contained, and that its malevolent energy never harmed anyone again. The house was finally at peace, the oppressive presence gone. The shadows no longer moved of their own accord, and the air felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. I knew that the battle was far from over, but for now, we had won. I took the doll and the dagger and locked them away, ensuring that they could never be used to summon the spirit again. The ancient tome I buried deep in the attic, its dark secrets hidden from the world. The house would always carry the scars of what had happened, but it was finally free from the doll's curse. As for my friend, he carried the burden with strength and resolve, his will unbroken. We remained vigilant, always aware of the spirit's presence, but knowing that we had done everything in our power to contain it. The battle was far from over, but for now, we had won. Part 5. The house felt different, lighter. The oppressive presence was gone, but the memory of it lingered, like a dark stain on my soul. My friend, now the vessel for the spirit, stayed close, and we devised ways to monitor the spirit's influence. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the shadows of our ordeal were never far from my thoughts. Days turned into weeks, and I threw myself into researching ways to permanently banish the spirit. The ancient tome, though hidden away, remained a source of knowledge and fear. I sought the help of scholars, occultists, and anyone with knowledge of dark magic. The consensus was grim. Binding a spirit of such power was nearly impossible, and finding a permanent solution was fraught with danger. My friend, though resolute, began to show signs of strain. The spirit's whispers grew more insistent, its malevolent influence chipping away at his resolve. We both knew the binding was a temporary measure, a fragile dam holding back a flood of darkness. The time we had bought was running out. One night, as I sat in the study, the air grew cold, and the familiar sense of dread settled over me. My friend entered the room, his face pale, his eyes haunted. "It's growing stronger," he said, his voice strained. "We need to find a permanent solution." I nodded, my mind racing. The tome's final pages spoke of a ritual of banishment, one that required immense power and sacrifice. It was our last hope, but the risks were unimaginable. I retrieved the tome, its leather cover cold and foreboding, and we began to prepare. The ritual required a convergence of energy, a sacred place, a powerful artifact, and the blood of the willing. We needed to find a location steeped in ancient magic, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. After weeks of searching, we discovered an old abandoned church on the outskirts of town, a place whispered about in local legends. The night of the ritual arrived, and we made our way to the church. The air was thick with anticipation and fear, the moon casting an eerie glow over the crumbling structure. We set up the ritual space in the nave, drawing a circle of salt and placing the doll and dagger in the center. My friend stood within the circle, his resolve unwavering. I began the incantations, my voice echoing through the empty church. The candles flickered, their flames casting long shadows on the stone walls. The air grew colder, and I could feel the spirit's rage building, its energy swirling around us like a storm. The shadows seemed to pulse and breathe, and the ground trembled beneath our feet. As the incantation reached its climax, I took the ceremonial knife and made a small cut on my palm, letting the blood fall onto the doll. The spirit let out a piercing scream, and the room was filled with a blinding light. The air crackled with energy, and I could feel the spirit being drawn into the circle, its malevolent presence struggling against the binding. My friend stepped forward, his eyes glowing with an eerie light. He began to chant, his voice merging with mine, the power of the ritual surging through us. The air grew colder still, and the light intensified, the spirit's screams echoing through the church. The ground shook, and the shadows twisted and writhed. The spirit's energy was overwhelming, a tidal wave of darkness threatening to engulf us. But we pressed on, our voices rising above the chaos, the power of the ritual binding the spirit within the circle. Then, with a final, desperate scream, the spirit was drawn into the doll. The light faded, and the church fell silent. My friend collapsed to the ground, his energy spent, but the spirit was contained. The ritual had worked, and the spirit was bound once more. But the victory was bittersweet. The ritual had taken its toll, and my friend's body lay motionless, his life force drained by the immense power of the banishment. I knelt beside him, tears streaming down my face, the weight of our sacrifice heavy on my heart. I buried the doll and the dagger in the churchyard, ensuring that they could never be used to summon the spirit again. The ancient tome I left in the church, its dark secrets hidden from the world. The church itself, now a place of sacrifice and binding, stood as a testament to our struggle, a silent guardian against the darkness. The days that followed were a blur of grief and reflection. I had lost a dear friend, but his sacrifice had saved countless lives. The house, once a place of terror, was now a sanctuary, free from the spirit's malevolent influence. But the shadows of our ordeal would always remain, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the veil. As I stood in the churchyard, the moonlight casting a soft glow over the graves, I made a silent vow. I would protect the world from the darkness, ensuring that the spirit could never return. My friend's sacrifice would not be in vain, and the shadows would never again claim another soul. The journey had changed me, marking my soul with the scars of battle, but I had emerged stronger, more resolute. The darkness had been vanquished, and the light had prevailed. And though the shadows would always linger, I would stand as a guardian, a beacon of hope against the encroaching night.